Thank you everyone for giving up their Friday evening. Hopefully that'll be worth it. Dan asked me to, Mr. Selmeczy asked me to do just kind of brief bio at the beginning for anyone who doesn't love me, or doesn't. Okay. For anyone who doesn't love me, welcome to talk. What I was going to say is I have always loved reading, and I was really lucky to grow up in a family that really encouraged reading. We all read a lot on our own, in bed with flashlights when we weren't supposed to, and my parents read to us a lot, even when we could read to ourselves. And I had an amazing 7th and 8th grade English teacher who I still see every time we go back to Spokane, who really fostered that love of literature even more. And 7th grade, I knew I wanted to be an English teacher. So that's what I studied in college. I have a BA in literature. And I've taught English literature and writing for 10 years, 9 at this school, so in the high school. So I've taught the freshmen through the seniors, all of the levels, the ancient, the medieval, the Renaissance to modern, and the American. I've helped develop the high school English curriculum. So I really love it. I'm really familiar with it. And often parents will say, oh, I really wish I was reading what my students are reading, or what my kids are reading in your class, or I wish I could audit the class because I didn't have this. So hopefully one result of the talk is just to encourage everyone. You know, we don't have to be done with our reading education. We can keep going. It's something that we can do our whole lives. So I really believe in the power of literature to move our hearts and our souls and to make us better people, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So obviously the evening's title for the evening is Why is Literature at the Foundation? Well, the foundation of what? I'm trying to use this new gadget here. So literature is at the foundation of the liberal arts education, which is obviously what we're doing here. But what exactly is a liberal arts education? It has always been understood to be, it's an education that provides the knowledge required for a free person to flourish. And by free person, we mean several things. Of course, just actually free, so not enslaved. But also a free person, their mind is not held captive by oppressive forces. They're not easily swayed by every opinion they hear and by every new fad and by every, terrible argument that's given to them in sort of an excited way. A free person is free. They're not held captive by their own emotions. They've learned to experience their emotions but control them. And literature helps us to do this. A free person's mind is not constrained to just one experience, not just the experience that they know. They're able to imagine other people's experiences and other times and places and cultures and incorporate that into how they see the world and decisions that they make. And of course, the most important part of being free, and we especially emphasize that here at our school, is being free from sin. So the liberal arts education should be giving us the knowledge to, be making the correct decisions to help us make wise decisions for ourselves and our family and community. And literature trains us how to do this from a very young age, which is one reason it's at the foundation. It starts to work for us very early on. So we're going to look for a minute. I hope the glare isn't in the way, but we're going to look, trying to kind of tie this in, sort of the theme for the whole year, and back to the talk that Mr. Selmeczy gave at the beginning of the year, talking about the whole tree of classical education, and he focused on piety. And up here, we're very familiar, right, with the trivium. We're constantly talking about grammar, logic, rhetoric, and all of these stages. And gymnastics and music, we know what those things are, but we kind of always skip that part. I know he covered it some in his talk. We're really going to focus on music because music, properly understood classically, it music is the muses, right? Anything that the muses are inspiring. So art. And actually there's 9 muses in Greek theology, or not theology, well it was, but mythology. And 4 of them, and kind of 5 of them, depending how you talk about them, have to do with literature. So there was a muse for comedy and for tragedy, for heroic poetry, for love poetry, lyric poetry, and also for history, which they understood as being about, not entirely, but largely about heroic acts. So this also is literature. So way down here at the foundation of the tree, obviously after piety, although they're connected. So gymnastics is forming the body, and music, the things inspired by the muses, are forming the emotions, the heart, the soul, our feelings. And this is something that happens at a very young age, right? We read stories to kids and they feel things, and even before they have the vocabulary to say, necessarily to name all of those emotions or to talk about them, they're feeling it, and this makes them feel proud, or this makes them feel, oh, that was a terrible way to act. And so very early on, this is starting to form them. And then obviously it moves up, and we use literature in, we can use it with the grammar and the logic and the rhetoric, and we keep referring back to it when we get up to like natural and moral philosophy. So it's something that's used continually, but we can use it from very early on. Music, sorry, I'm trying to figure out where the next slide is. Aristotle talks a lot about this. Plato and Aristotle did. Aristotle said that it trains what he calls intuition. And C.S. Lewis makes a similar argument to Aristotle's in his book, The Abolition of Man. And then C.S. Lewis uses the word intuition, and he also brings in the word imagination. And he talks about how we learn to make judgments about the good and the beautiful, but we learn in a different way than we learn about math or science. We learn through intuition and through imagination. So, for example, in something like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the children, even young children, whom they might not understand all the symbolism, and Aslan is like Christ and all these things, but they feel how terrible it is when Edmund betrays his siblings. And then they're afraid for him when he's going to die as a result. And they're relieved when Aslan rescues him. So even though they might not get the whole picture, they might not be ready yet for the theology behind all of it, they feel all those things, and we help them to say, yeah, you feel like that's terrible because it would be terrible. It would be a sin to betray them. And yeah, you're relieved that this happens. You think Aslan's amazing because sacrifice is a good thing. So they have these feelings, and then we give them the words, we help them to understand, and we help form how they're supposed to be thinking about it. But that doesn't happen until they first have had this feeling, this engagement with the story. This quote is actually from the same book that Mr. Selmeczy used in his talk on piety, where we get this picture. The authors of the book say, without a well-stocked moral imagination, without trained sentiment, without a heart, there is no human flourishing. So this feeling is really important. And C.S. Lewis pushes it even a little further. In his Abolition of Man, he's talking about the heart. He calls it the middle element. And he says, it may even be said that it is by this middle element, the heart, that man is man. For by his intellect, he is mere spirit, and by his appetite, mere animal. But the heart, the feeling, the emotion, what it does to our souls is this thing that is particular to us and kind of brings these other two things together. And something else that music does, so literature, the arts, actual music, it invokes wonder. And this is also necessary. This is another reason it's foundational. We don't want to learn about anything unless there's first a wonder about it, an interest. So even something as simple as a lot of kids' poems, like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, right? We all know it, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. But it's wonderment. How I wonder what you are. Like, what is that up there? It's this cute little poem, but it's about wondering about the natural world and guessing what it could be and sort of making these mini little childish hypotheses. And so literature causes us to wonder about other places and other people, and then we want to learn more about it. So this is another reason it's at the bottom of everything else. It's really foundational to all these other things. So let's look more closely at how literature trains us to be free. And you could use a lot of different words, but I've kind of grouped it in two areas here. Literature trains us to be free because great literature is enjoyable and engaging. These things go together. And because it's civilizing and ennobling. So let's start with sort of the easy ones. Enjoyable seems really obvious. I mean, of course, we want to read stories that are enjoyable, but this can be kind of easy to forget, actually, especially in a classroom setting. Well, this is the curriculum, we got to get through it, you just got to read it, kind of. But the reason we're choosing these books, and the books we should enjoy them. The stories should be interesting. Because if they're not interesting, no one's going to want to learn any of the other deeper things you can learn from them. They're going to Any deeper message is going to go in one ear and out the other, unless they're enjoyable. And engaging, it's very similar, obviously, but I'm using the word engaging to mean that the reader cares about what happens. It moves us. We're afraid when characters we love are in peril, and we're relieved when they're safe. We mourn with them when something terrible happens, when there's a tragedy. So, when we read like Banner in the Sky, and Rudy can't get to the top of the citadel, but he sees his father's shirt, like that moves us. When Huck doesn't turn Jim over in Huckleberry Finn, we're moved by it. We care. We want to know what happens. And so these two things have to go together for us to want to continue reading, to be interested in it. But it's also, it's forming us, it's training us because it's building compassion and empathy. And it does this for characters that are like us, right? Well, this little girl is sad because her father dies, or her best friend's moving, or she lost her favorite toy. We get that. That's just like us. But it also works for characters who, they seem like they're not like us. But then as we keep reading, we realize, oh wait, they are like us. They may live somewhere different or a totally different time, but we have this shared humanity. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this book. I'm probably not pronouncing her name correctly, but it's about a Japanese girl, Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. She is based on a true story, and she was 2, I think, when the atomic bomb went off. I think it's in Hiroshima. Anyway, she developed leukemia, and there's this idea that if she folds 1,000 cranes, she'll be okay. So at first glance, it's this totally other place, different setting, different culture, but quickly kids can realize, oh, she's just like me, really. I'd be afraid of that. I'd be happy that my friends were there supporting me. So one of the ways this engagement with literature forms us and trains us, it's just building our humanity, our compassion, our empathy, our ability to see the humanity of others despite what looks like differences or real differences, but we can see past those. So this is another reason it's so foundational, because it's points us towards just the foundation of our shared humanity. And this sounds a little cheesy, but I think it's very true. And it's my argument for why we read some of the things we read, say, in the older levels. Another thing I'm trying to capture with engaging is that literature is a safe way to experience a bunch of different things. Really, really intense emotions or difficult situations that the characters are going through we're lucky that we're not going through them, but in a way we're still grappling with it, even though it's this other person who's not us. And so in this safe way where we're grappling with difficult situations and thinking about what our emotions are and how we should think about it and how we should react to it. And this too is just kind of adding to our store, basically. That's part of what the Greeks were trying to capture with their Greek tragedy, this idea of catharsis. You go to the play, and these terrible things are happening on stage, and you're kind of feeling like when Oedipus is slowly figuring out the truth, you're afraid for him. And then when he's, you also kind of feel bad for him, like it's not his fault, but you realize his pride has been part of the problem. And true catharsis is supposed to make you go, I'm proud too. Like, how is this going to play out in my life? And so you have all these intense emotions, and you're experiencing them, but you're not the one going through the particular situation. But it's adding to our understanding of humanity, and it's sort of building this store of how we will deal with our own lives, our own situations. So going back to the free man is not held captive by his emotions. Experiencing these things, being engaged in stories and dealing with them is part of how we train ourselves and we train children to not be held captive by their emotions when it comes to their actual life. They've dealt with some of these things. They've pondered these things. They've considered what it would be like to have these experiences. And they've already started to kind of figure out how to deal with that a little bit. Sorry, one sec. So great literature is engaging, and it pulls us in to experience the story along with the characters, and we learn more fully what it means to be human. Oh wait, sorry, no, didn't have to go back. Okay, so the other half of this is the civilizing and ennobling. By civilizing, I'm gonna mean how we interact with community, and ennobling, I'm trying to capture more of the personal moral element. Okay, but so great literature is civilizing. What is it? What's civilizing? Like if something is civilizing, what does it do? Well, if something is civilizing, it brings order, right? It brings civil order, moral order. It puts people in right relation to each other and to their society. Something that is civilizing encourages self-control, correct behavior, virtuous behavior. Something that's civilizing brings people out of our barbaric state. And as we all know, basically we live in a civilized society mostly, obviously, but every time we keep having this generation of barbarians being born, right? Children are barbarians. They are, because they're completely controlled by their emotions, and they're selfish, and they don't know the rules, and we have to teach them right from wrong. They're actually literally barbarians, and we have to civilize them. And one of the ways we do this is literature. And obviously it's not the only way we do this, right? We teach them that they do have to be taught rules, and there are authority figures, and we have standards of behavior, and all of these things. And so in school, the kids read the Baltimore Catechism when they're young, and then they're doing moral theology when they're older. Obviously, all these things are important parts of becoming civilized. Clearly, literature is not the only way that this happens. But literature is a very important way this happens, partially because the rules and the theology and the logic can seem very abstract. Right? They can all rattle off the answer for all the Baltimore Catechism. Well, I shouldn't do this because and the older kids are very quick to point out, well, isn't it true in the Catechism that this, and Father so-and-so said this. This is all important, it's all true, but it can seem very abstract. I shouldn't lie, I shouldn't steal, I shouldn't do any of these things. It's all true, we need it. Literature helps make these things more concrete because they're actual examples, then we feel something about these examples. And that can happen from very early on. So before kids can even rattle off all the Baltimore Catechism stuff, or know the correct terms for this kind of, this or that, they read stories and they have a reaction to things, and we help them understand, well, that's because this is virtuous. This is not virtuous. That's why we feel that way. We can encourage that. It can happen very early. And Aristotle talks about this a lot. He says that since virtue is about delighting and loving and hating aright, clearly nothing is more necessary to learn and to make a habit than to judge rightly and to delight in good characters and noble acts. Okay, so let's just kind of take this apart. Delighting and loving and hating, he's talking about the emotional response to things, right? And we have these emotional responses when we're young, when we're old. So the virtue is about having the correct emotional response to things. And habit, right? Forming us, training us, judging rightly, being able to tell which things should be loved, which things should be hated, which things we should want to do, which things we should avoid. And he says this is done through good characters and noble acts. It's done through stories. We're taught these things through stories. Let's go to one more. So another way to say this, great literature, lots of Greek literature obviously as well. Great literature is civilizing and ennobling because it shapes your character by teaching you to love what's noble and aspire to it, and to despise what's base and spurn it, to avoid it. It fuses feelings to reason. The feelings happen first, and then we start adding the reason, explaining it, and they go together. So it's not just the reason, it's not just the rules, it's not just the lists, it's not just the you can't. It's the feeling goes with it, it backs it up. I know I shouldn't be terrible to my siblings because when I read a book about these two kids arguing, it's really ugly, right? The Secret Garden. When the kids, before either of them kind of learns, they're terrible. It's so ugly the way they talk to each other. And even kids who might talk that way to their siblings, when they're reading a different story, they're going, oh, why are they so awful? Well, they're awful. It's bad, isn't it? You don't like that because it's really ugly. It's selfish. Sin is ugly. And they start to get it. So we're always directing them, right? We're not just handing them stories and leaving them to be with their emotions. It still has to be directed. We need the reason, but they go together. And just trying to impose the logic and the reason and the rules isn't usually going to get us very far. Occasionally you have a person that all makes sense. But most of us need a more personal, emotional approach having to do with the heart, this human middle element that holds it all together. And literature can do that in a unique way because it can be done with very, very young children, and then it continues through our whole lives. So it's so foundational because they don't have to know fancy words, they don't have to know rules, they don't have to know what's going on in church yet. They can understand the story. One of the greatest explanations for this role that literature plays comes from Sir Philip Sidney, an English writer. He was writing in England in the 1570s, and he's writing at a time when the Puritans in England were a very powerful political and social voice. And they were very against fiction, plays, literature, poetry, because they thought it was frivolous and because they thought it was lies. Well, that story you just made up is not true, therefore it's a lie. And it's a whole lot of emotion going on, and that we don't like that. And so some writers try to kind of just say, well, literature is harmless, it's not a big deal, it's just a story. But Philip Sidney actually pushes it farther, and he argues, no, it's not just okay, it's necessary. Fiction, stories, literature are necessary. And so he writes kind of the essay defending it, and it's called The Defense of Poesy. And poesy was basically just this classical term for any sort of literature. And he says, so in his essay, The Defense of Poesy, Philip Sidney says that poets are the first bringers in of all civility. because poets painteth the outward beauty of virtue. So they make virtue look beautiful, and then we want it. We're attracted to it. He says, no philosopher's precepts can sooner make you an honest man than the reading of Virgil. You can preach and philosophize all you want, and that will reach some people, but reading stories about great heroic people will reach almost everyone, because we want that too. We want to be like them. They seem real to us in a way that lists of rules are not. He actually even said that, he says the poet, I mean, he's a poet, so obviously he's a little, but he says the poet is superior to the philosopher and the historian, because he says the poet is more concrete than the philosopher and more universal than the historian. So it's not even to put down the philosopher or the historian, obviously, but he's getting to something true, which is that he's dealing with stories are universal and they're concrete. And so instead of just saying, well, no one should ever do this. Well, this guy should not have done this, so we can see why, because here are the terrible consequences. We can all point to it and discuss it and maybe disagree and look at it, but it's a thing. It's a real thing we can talk about and feel about and react to. Another one of the Puritans' criticisms about literature is that they said it aroused base emotions. But he said, actually, he says, he points again to Greek tragedy. He says, actually, tragedy openeth the greatest wounds, and it shows the ulcers that are usually covered by tissue, and it makes kings fear to be tyrants. So he's thinking of something like in Antigone, where Creon is basically a tyrant, and he's sure of what he's doing, and he won't listen to anyone else, and there are these terrible, horrible consequences. And so kings watching this would think, oh, maybe I should not just stick with my own rules without listening to anyone else, because they see these horrible results. Stories train our emotions and our character by affecting how we recognize and feel about vice and virtue. Literature shows you honesty and courage and loyalty and all their inherent nobility and makes you want them for yourself. That's from this great book. I just will suggest it now since I already brought it up. If you're kind of looking to, we're going to talk in a minute about reading the things that your kids are reading. But if you're also looking to just sort of fill in gaps in your own education, or just, gosh, I've always wanted to read that, or I feel like I should have read more classics, but I don't know where to start. This book's really good. It's literally called Invitation to the Classics. And although I just realized that's not actually the one I'm quoting. This one's what I'm quoting. It does a similar thing. They're both kind of, these are the great works that you should read, kind of suggestions to read. This one is sort of starting from the standpoint of, this is all of the gobbledygook being taught in college and some in high schools now. And this is why it's gobbledygook, and this is how we should actually look at the classics. So especially maybe if you have those like college-age kids, I think this is really helpful. And this one's kind of more of a general, what are the great Spanish classics, what are the great Greek classics, what are the great works of the Italian period, with a little bit about each author. So anyway, I'm going to have these up here if later you want to come write them down. They're very good, and this one's a little frightening if you have anyone going into the literary studies in college, but insightful. Okay.
Is that Mr. Darcy?
It is not. It is not Mr. Darcy. Does anyone know who this is? It is. It's Sidney Carton from Tale of Two Cities.
Oh, he's going up the scaffold.
He's going up the scaffold. That's right. Because you can say, well, real love is wanting what's best for the other. And this is true. But it's not a very moving sentence. But the scene where Sidney Carton gives up his life for his family is moving and will stick with you. Okay. Obviously, philosophy, just simple instruction, telling our kids rules, these all go hand in hand with it. So the argument isn't literature replaces all these things. It's that it's this amazing tool that we can use from very early on to do all these other things that we want to do. Now, because stories have the power to be so influential, we have to make sure we're choosing the correct ones. So, obviously, you could come up with a bunch of different criteria you would use to pick books for your children. But if we're kind of just like honing it down to the basics, when we're choosing literature for our children, we should be asking, is it enjoyable and engaging? Because as we've talked about, they're not going to be interested if it's not enjoyable and they don't care. And we should be asking, does it correctly depict virtue as good and vice? Oh my gosh. Well, there it is. I knew
This talk is so subversive.
I now don't have to worry about where I made my mistake. I know where it is. So this should say, does it correctly depict virtue as good and vice as evil? Well,
I'm going to take a picture of that.
look what they're teaching at this school. Yeah, that calls for a water. Okay. This seems really obvious, but it is really important, and it's especially important, I think, if you have a book, especially when you're getting to the older levels of reading, where really tragic things happen or very terrible things happen, and you could maybe ask, this is really upsetting. Why are we reading something like this? And I think that it's a very good argument to say, if bad things are being shown to be bad, if they're shown to be horrible and ugly and sinful and vicious, but good things are shown to be are being glorified and valued, then we're okay with the value system here. I mean, you might need to say this child is too sensitive to read this, and that's an individual kind of question. But if the value system is correct, then maybe it is good to be reading about really difficult, kind of terrible things sometimes that are shown to be terrible, because we see the awful consequences. We see how it ruins people's lives. We see maybe how people are tempted to sin or something. This is instructive. It's teaching us this is awful because of all these consequences. Look how it hurts this person. So it's correctly forming us. And this is how we know, it's kind of easy to look at book lists, maybe at other schools, especially in colleges, but in high schools and grade schools too, and just kind of say, oh, they're teaching all this new stuff. Well, stuff isn't wrong just because it's new, but stuff might be wrong if it's not doing this correctly. If it's glorifying or justifying bad behavior, that's why things might be wrong. Because it's encouraging, it's malforming the reader. It's using their emotions and training them towards the bad. So that's why, if we were going to go through book lists and weed things out, that would be why. This is glorifying something that is terrible. It's malforming people. It's training them incorrectly. So, we'll just hope there's no other giant flaws. Okay, we've been talking about how literature civilizes and ennobles the individual, but it also does this for society as a whole. And so before we can talk about kind of the benefits of a shared society, a shared culture in the family, let's just look at it in terms of the larger culture. So what are the benefits of a shared literary culture? Well, it civilizes and ennobles everyone. And part of how it does this, it transmits the values to the next generation. And actually, if we look back at the tree, so piety is here at the very bottom, and stories are part of how piety is passed on, right? Because piety is about the correct, the duty and the way we're supposed to treat family and God and society, how we're supposed to love them, and our duties towards them. And part of how this has been done, how that's been taught, is with stories, right? These stories of heroes, that's how you know what it means to be a good member of this society, because of the stories. So, like, the Iliad was always used because Paris is to be despised because he is cowardly and lustful and selfish. And Hector is to be praised because he's basically all the opposite. He is selfless and he is brave and he is loyal. So these stories help us to understand what piety means for us in our individual culture, because to a large extent piety is specific to our time and culture. And we're seeing this kind of start to fall apart as we don't have this shared literary culture anymore. Not everyone is reading the same things. It's getting harder and harder to transmit these values because we're not all looking at the same books anymore. References to stories. Another reason it's very helpful if we're all reading the same things is because references to stories communicate a great deal very quickly, right? This is why we've had the canon of literature. It's not the only reason, but it's been a helpful thing. We can say stuff like, oh, well, it's his Achilles heel, or, well, that's his white whale, or that guy's tilting at windmills. And in theory, we all kind of know basically what we're talking about. So instead of this huge, long explanation about, well, this guy's very idealistic and he's a little crazy, but he means well, but he often gets himself into trouble and blah, blah, blah. He's tilting at windmills, right? And we do this with kids, too. You can say, well, if you keep lying to me about all these things, one of these days, you're going to really need help, and I'm not going to believe you because you're a liar. Or you could just say, don't be the boy who cried wolf. I'm not going to believe you. So this shared literary culture makes these kind of quick exchange of ideas and instruction possible. Kind of the more classical example of this has to do with piety. The Greeks, the Romans and everyone after them looked to this moment from the Aeneid when Aeneas is carrying his father, and his father is carrying the household gods, and he has his son, and they're escaping to, continue their family line. And it's piety because it's past generations and future generations and the gods and his duty to them. And so in just this brief image, it sums up this huge concept. And finally, the shared literary culture, it transcends age and race and income and all of these things, right? Pop culture references, as we know, if you've ever tried to teach teenagers, don't last for very long. I was just asking them something about some actor. I was like, who's a really manly actor? And the people they were naming and the people I were naming were extremely different. So, pop culture is only kind of like, it's so very temporary. But these stories that people have been reading for hundreds of years, they span all of that. And, so despite what is being done in English curriculums in so many places, the Western canon is for everyone. It really is. And it's so sad that people don't see that anymore. That things that we have read for hundreds of years are being thrown out for something new just so we can say, well, we've checked off that group, we've checked off that group. And, really intelligent people see that. I don't know if this is apocryphal or not. I've read this in many places, but supposedly Maya Angelou, when she was a girl and read Shakespeare for the first time, thought that he was a black girl. Because she said, how else could he feel? How could he understand what I feel? Because it was so immediate to her. She didn't think like, this guy doesn't get me. He's a white man keeping me down. She just she thought, yeah, we agree. He understands. Another slightly longer example of this, W.E.B. Dubois, in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, he wrote, I sit with Shakespeare, and he winces not. Across the color line, I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas. I summon Aristotle and Aurelius, and what soul I will, and they all come graciously. So, wed with truth, I dwell above the veil. So, the canon, going back to the canon and having these books that we all have read and all are familiar with, it civilizes and ennobles the whole society. It helps us to communicate ideas and express the same thing and teach values and virtues. And it doesn't mean that we never bring in new books. Many books, newer books, deserve to be added, but they should be added and not used to replace other things. Okay, so literature is important, it's foundational for all of these reasons. Let's look at how we act on this. How do we create a literary culture in our families? And the first, it seems so obvious, just having books in the home. And this doesn't mean necessarily buying a lot of books, right? The library, borrowing them, just having them around, having them accessible. You have to have them accessible, which I learned kind of early on. When our oldest Blaze was little, I was really, he was allowed to tear apart the kitchen, but do not touch the bookshelf. Don't touch the bookshelf, because it was ordered in this very particular way. And then I don't know if Pete said something or if it just clicked, but I finally realized I was making the books this thing that were not for him, that he was not allowed to have. And I realized that he kept going back to it, probably because he wasn't allowed to have them. So maybe it ended up working in some sort of I'm brilliant. But I finally realized I had to just let go of that. And if they got bent, they got bent. And if they got out of order, they got out of order. But that I needed to be encouraging that. And clearly it worked, because actually as I was getting ready for this talk, I thought there might be something useful in this book called Who Killed Homer. There wasn't anything I could pull out exactly. But I was just flipping through it, and I came across 3 bookmarks that clearly my children had put there. And I'm pretty sure that they each put this is this Thomas the Tank Engine flashcard that I know it was Blaze, because we had them when Blaze was little. And then I came across one that I'm pretty sure was Simeon, because he's our rule follower and this is an actual bookmark. And then I came across something from a Disney CD that I believe was Seraphim. So at some point, each one of our kids, for whatever reason, has pulled this book out and flipped through it. And they've all gone through this phase where they stack up all the books, and they're really attracted to my old ones that are very brittle. I don't know why. They know they're more important. And they're going, it's okay, I'm being careful. And I have to wince, because they think it's important. They think it's important because it's important to us. And if, they are interested in it. So that's my anecdote. Let's do just sort of scientific proof. Quite a few studies have been done on how it is helpful to have books in the home. So this one was done in 31 different societies. Book-oriented culture is a shared rather than individual resource. Books cost money, but family bookshelves may be filled with regular loans from libraries or bookish friends. Building on this evidence, the current paper extends scholarly culture theory, blah, blah, blah. It's all very scholarly. Bookish, they call it bookishness, is the term that they use. Bookishness as a practice to which youth are accultured creates cognitive benefits which are not only immediately, but also last into adulthood. And they're independent of educational and occupational standing. Although bookishness also significantly enhances both forms of attainment. So in a very boring way, it's saying, they look at 2 things. They're looking at how does this help you in terms of attainment, the jobs we want. And they say it improves in that way. And then it also improves in these things that are less concrete, harder to sort of define and measure, but cognitive skills, just understanding that it improves in all of these ways as well. These are like the most interesting sections from these reports, if you can believe it or not. It's kind of hard to read through this stuff, but I do think it's kind of interesting because quite a few studies about this have been done. This one's done in 27 different countries, and this is just the abstract from the much, much longer paper. Children growing up in homes with many books get 3 years more schooling than children from bookless homes. And this is independent of their parents' education, occupation, or class. So one of these things these studies usually look at is this actually a class thing? Is it only help kids who are from these sort of higher levels of society? And all of the studies show that that is not true. In fact, in some of the studies argue that it actually helps the people who are in kind of the lower economic categories. It helps them even more to have only a handful of books in their houses. This is as great an advantage as having a university educated rather than an unschooled parent, and twice the advantage of having a professional rather than an unskilled father. So they compare it to these other studies. It holds equally in rich nations and in poor, in the past and in the present, under communism, capitalism, and apartheid, and most strongly in China. And then it says it's from 27 nations, and then it has all this really technical language that I don't really understand. But the point, they're proving that they've done all these different things. And these are just two of, there are many, many studies like that. So, and in fact, one that I came across said that having books in the home, it didn't even matter if the parents encouraged it or sat down with them. Obviously, that's much better if the parents are very involved. But this particular study looked at whether or not the parents were pushing it, the parents were really driven to have them move up educationally. Just having the books in the home was enough to make them interested and wonder and want it for themselves and seek it out. So it's this huge benefit. Okay. So just having books in your home and having them accessible, encouraging it. Advertise for books. Let your children see you read. And so obviously we're talking about us, we're going to talk more in a minute about us reading to them, but also just us reading our own books. And obviously a lot of us are doing reading now on phones and iPads and things, and you can have, the Iliad on your iPad, and that's great. I do really think that there's something to holding an actual book for a couple of reasons. One, because in a lot of our households, we're not really letting kids use the iPads and the phone. We're not letting them have access to that technology as much. So that's not their experience of reading. If we want their experience of reading to be the book that we got from the library, the book that comes from school, we should be modeling that we also are holding an actual book. I personally think there's something more personal and immediate about just like actually holding the book and turning the pages, but I'm an English teacher, so maybe I'm just partial to that. But I also think them seeing us with the book is different than us reading something here, because if we're holding our screen, they can assume we're reading. They don't know if we're checking our Twitter feed or if we're reading the Iliad or if we're, they don't know what we're doing. If we're doing this, they can see the cover and they go, what is that about? Or maybe they're not. Maybe they don't ask what it's about, but they know that we're reading this. That we're not just going from like article to article and just like spiraling down, some Facebook trend or whatever. They know what we're spending our time on. And so if we want them to be doing that, we have to model it. This quote is from this guy, this is actually from an interview with him. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Trelease, thank you, I knew you would. He wrote this book called The Read Aloud Handbook. There's a lot of this similar kind of stuff and a lot of lists of great books to read aloud for ages and whatnot. And so this is actually from an interview. He's like in his 70s now. But someone was interviewing him and just asking questions. And so he says, reading aloud to your child is a commercial for reading. When you read aloud, you're whetting a child's appetite for reading. The truth is, what isn't advertised in our culture gets no attention. and awareness has to come before desire. A child who has been read to will want to learn to read herself. She will want to do what she sees her parents doing. But if a child never sees anyone pick up a book, she isn't going to have that desire. So they copy us in the most ridiculous things. They walk around with like calculators, like, yeah, no, okay, just a minute. The baby's crying, because that's what we sound like. So they want to do everything we're doing. So if we want them to be reading books, we need to be reading books and modeling that. And the third thing, so having books in the home, advertising it by doing it ourselves, and finally, obviously, reading to our children and discussing it with them, sharing the experience. And it's really important that we don't stop reading to them just because they can read to themselves. We know we have to read to the 4-year-old because the 4-year-old can't read himself. But we get, then they learn to read in first grade, and you're kind of still helping them. By second grade, they can kind of do it, and we're busy, and so they're reading on their own. And obviously, we want them to be reading on our own. But even once they can read on their own, we should keep reading to them out loud, as long as they'll let us. This same guy talks about why. He says a child's reading level doesn't catch up to his listening level until 8th grade. So that means that what they can read on their own, what you read to them, they can understand more than they can read on their own. And I actually think this even goes past 8th grade, because reading aloud to even high schoolers, they'll get more if I'm reading it out loud to them, because I know the story better. So I know when to pause and what to emphasize. A word that they might not recognize and would struggle over, when I say it, they kind of pick it up in context. I mean, this happens even with adults, right? I will be reading something, I think, I don't know what that means. But if I'm listening to a lecture by someone who does know what it means, I sort of pick it up. So he argues, you can and should be reading 7th grade books to 5th grade kids, for example. A 5th grader can enjoy a more complicated plot than she can read herself. He says, in conversation, we tend to use shorthand, not full sentences. But the language in books is very rich, and in books there are complete sentences. A child who hears more sophisticated words has a giant advantage over a child who hasn't heard those words. So they have an advantage in conversation. They have an advantage, just stuff like testing. What is it called? Standardized testing. They have an advantage in their own reading as they're picking up these words. And finally, reading aloud increases a child's attention span. Another reason we should be doing it with older kids. Just making them sit there and listen to the story, an enjoyable and engaging story, so that they want to know what happens. They're learning to sit still and listen to what's going on. Obviously, once you get to high school, I don't know how many high schoolers want to be read to. I don't know. Maybe it'd be nice. Mom, would you read your homework to me? My homework to me. But so then we're moving more into the discussing it with them and asking them lots of questions and sort of pulling that kind of thing out to them. But I think as long as they'll let you and when you can fit it in. And also, obviously, this takes a lot of time, obviously. I think that a way that we can be doing this also, if we don't have time to set aside to do this, things like books on tape in the car, we're still sharing it with them. We're both listening to it, but we're driving or maybe while we're getting dinner ready or something, or so we're still getting stuff done. We have busy lives, but we're still sharing that experience of all listening to it. We can pause and answer questions. My kids want us to pause. I was listening to Peter Pan, which is a fantastic story. If you have never read Peter Pan, you should read it. It's so fantastic. But like every 4 sentences, I was pausing and explaining some British phrase or why this happens, or because it's actually very kind of interesting and philosophical. But it definitely provoked a lot of conversation. okay, this is really long, but you're going to have to bear with me. And then we're going to get to the very practical, what you can be reading from our curriculum with your kids. But before that, I just really had to end on this. I had to end this little section on this. This is from William Faulkner's Nobel Prize speech, when he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1949. This is just the end of the speech. And so he's writing right after the Second World War, and he is talking about how writers of that generation, understandably, have this just kind of despair. Because there's been these wars, and they feel like, what is the point? And humanity is just awful and terrible, and I mean, I guess we'll all continue, and the books were all just kind of about like, I guess we'll just keep talking and trying, and it was all very depressing and sort of, and defeatist. And so this last part of the speech, he's pushing back against that. He says, I decline to accept the end of man. It is easy enough to say that man is immortal simply because he will endure, that when the last ding-dong of doom has clanged and faded from the last worthless rock hanging tideless in the last red and dying evening, that even then there will still be one more sound, that of his puny, inexhaustible voice still talking. So yeah, we could say, well, I guess humanity will continue, because we all just continue. But he says that's not good enough. He says, I refuse to accept this. I believe that man will not merely endure, he will prevail. He is immortal, not because he alone among creatures has an inexhaustible voice, but because he has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance. The poet's, the writer's duty is to write about these things. It is his privilege to help men endure by lifting his heart, by reminding him of the courage and honor and hope and pride and compassion and pity and sacrifice which have been the glory of his past. The poet's voice need not merely be the record of man. It can be one of the props, the pillars to help him endure and prevail. Really like doing that with the seniors for American literature. So just to kind of sum it up, before we get to the really practical. We read great literature with our children in order to train our hearts and minds to admire what is noble and despise what is base, so that we may be free persons in the truest sense. And we're going to look now, so that's kind of like the lecture part of it, but the really practical part of it, I asked all of the teachers 1 through 12 who teach English literature, I said I want to suggest I want to suggest that parents are reading with their kids books from our curriculum, but that's not very helpful to just say, well, read some stuff from our curriculum, because there's so many books and people have multiple kids and multiple grades. And so I said, if you could pick just one book from the level you're teaching that you think it would be especially helpful for parents to read along with their child, what would it be and why? And then most of them gave me kind of discussion questions to start with. So if you want to help pass stuff out. Rachel, will you help on this side? So the teachers gave these suggestions, and I did some of the summaries a little bit, and I added some questions. Obviously, we're not going to go like line by line through this whole thing. I'm just going to kind of mention each book, and if people had questions at this, questions about individual books, that's great. And these are just suggestions. Like it's a starting place. But if your kid comes home with some different book they're reading that they're really excited about, do that one. And you don't need to be trying to do this at the exact same time that they're reading it in class. Especially, again, if you have kids in a bunch of different classes, that might be literally impossible. You could try to pick one and do it Okay, I know I have an incoming 4th grader, so during the summer I'm going to read this 4th grade book. And then when they get to that, I'll be ready for it. Or you can think, okay, well, I'm gonna read what my 6th grader is reading. I can only do one this year. I'm gonna do what my oldest kid is reading, knowing that all the rest of them are gonna come up through it, and I'll hit all of them as they go, and I'm just gonna slowly. So it's just a suggestion. When you can do it, how you can do it. You don't have to be doing it out loud, but that's great if you do. So it's really just however it fits in with your family. And if your kid has some other book that works, that's great. Because we like visuals. Sorry, excuse me. So for the 1st grade, Miss Quackenbush suggested Little House in the Big Woods. I'm so glad that she did because I love this book, and I think the Little House books are really great books to read for lots of reasons. I think it brings up really the exact kind of questions that kids should be asking, like how are these little girls like you? How are they just like you? And how is their life very different than yours? What would it be like to have never seen, the first time they go to town is the first time they've seen 2 houses next to each other, ever, in their lives? What would that be like? So I think the Little House books are this perfect blend of recognizing the humanity in other people and also really kind of grappling with what it would be like to live in a very different circumstance. And they're sweet, and they're very family-oriented, and the parents are virtuous, maybe a tad crazy, but very virtuous. And they're very accessible. They're really great books. And so I'm really glad that she picked this one. Miss Cepeda suggested 2. Her main suggestion was Wind in the Willows. She reads little sections of it out loud to the 2nd graders. The reason she gave sort of an additional suggestion, the language for Wind in the Willows, it can be pretty difficult. A 2nd grader definitely can't handle it on his or her own, but they can handle it being read to them. But if your kid's really struggling with it, or if you're really struggling with it, Charlotte's Web is another great book, although I didn't have questions for that one. But both of these books are about friendship. So a lot of what they're pulling out of these 2nd grade books are what makes a good friend, how do you be a friend when the other person's really difficult. Which of the, one of her questions she gave is, which one of these do you think is the best friend? Which one of these characters would you like to be your friend? And so both of these 2nd grade books are really about that. How you're a good friend, how you sacrifice for your friends, even when they're difficult. And just at this point, if you have a question about a particular thing, go ahead and stop me. For 3rd grade, I actually have not read this one, but reading the kind of the summary and some information about it made me want to read it. For 3rd grade, we have the Cabin Faced West. It's apparently based on the author's ancestor. And George Washington makes a guest appearance in this book. And what Miss Naden pointed out, and I have here in the little description, she was saying that even starting in 3rd grade, they start to get into kind of more complex stories. The characters are feeling a little more complex things, emotions that the kids might not necessarily be able to, they kind of understand it, but they might not know what it's called or why you would feel that. And so we're getting to the point where we're kind of leading them through understanding, why does she feel that? Why do you think someone would react that way? So we're kind of getting to this a higher level of complexity, which requires a little more leading and direction from us. For 4th grade, Island of the Blue Dolphins, a classic, probably a lot of you read it. I somehow did not know until I lived here that it's loosely based on a true story. And kind of like an imaginative version of what might have happened. Also questions of friendship, although different kinds of friendship, because it's friendship with a dog, and then she has this brief friendship with another girl, and they can't speak each other's language. So how can you form a friendship when you can't even speak? And here, very clear examples of of virtues, perseverance and loyalty and like real meaningful sacrifice. It's sadder, so kids are starting to deal with loss and tragedy and how they feel about that, and but admire how the character handles it and perseveres and rises above. And fifth grade, Where the Red Fern Grows, another classic that probably a lot of people read at some point. When I was a fifth grader, when you were like a fourth grader, you always heard about how the fifth grader read this out loud. The fifth grade teacher read this out loud, and she always cried at the end, which was a big deal because Miss Gottstein was like the toughest teacher in the school. And so you're all kind of like, oh, I can't wait to see Miss Gottstein cry. But then as she's reading it, half the class is kind of doing this, you know, and the boys are really trying hard to pretend that they don't care. But because it's a boy and his dogs, a lot of them.
Jim Trelease has a great story.
It's a really great
My
book.
son Andy, I was reading this to him when he was probably too young, and he like pulled hair out of his head. But you should hear Jack Tierney's critique of this story.
Jack Tierney's?
He has a totally different. He says, yeah, it's a story about this family that's practically starving, yet he saves $5 to buy dogs.
Yeah.
That aren't edible.
That's called cynicism.
It's a good question. Never thought of that.
And here's that actually is something I like had all these things to say and passed them up, but that reminded me. I don't think we need to be sort of expecting or forcing our kids to like all of this. I think it's perfectly fine if you're reading something with your kid or you're just asking them about what they're reading in school and they dislike it. That's fine. That's something to work with. Because if they really don't like it, they care. They care enough to really not like it. And you can have a conversation with that. So if they like hate everything, I don't know what to tell you. But you just kind of work with what you've got. Like if they're like, oh yeah, I really just, why does he do this? He should have been using that money to help his family. Fine, that's a conversation. You have the conversation, and what I try to do, like with the high schoolers, and I think you can do this with younger kids too, if they don't like it, it's fine, but just press them for reasons. It can't just be, oh, I don't like it, because that might mean, well, I skimmed it very quickly last night, and I don't really understand it. If you don't like it, it's fine, but you have to tell me why. Point to specifics. Like, what is it that you disagree with? Where do you think the character should have done something different? So they're still talking about it. They're still engaged. They're still thinking intelligently about it. So I think that it's fine. Just work with whatever they bring to the table. Do you want to add?
I have a question. Would you force a child to read something that was objectively really important to read, maybe outside of school, but they just didn't find it interesting? It's like, you have to read this book.
I kind of go back and forth with that. The like me in a perfect world says yes.
Yeah.
The me who has strong-willed children.
And other things to do.
And other things to do.
I do want to die on that.
And a classroom full of strong-willed teenagers to teach. I don't know. I think it kind of depends on the kid. And I think if it's going to be a fight and you're forcing them to do it, they're going to not like it to spite you. And it kind of shoots the whole thing in the foot.
But there's no such thing as a book that they have to read.
Yeah, I don't think it's worth forcing them. I think you can, depending on the book, if it's the kind of thing you can read out loud that many kids would understand, and maybe maybe everyone will get something out of it, maybe they won't. But yeah, I don't think it's worth saying, this is what you're reading this summer, I don't care what your opinion is. Because there's so many other great things. If there were only 5 great books in the world, then yes, we would be in that situation. But there's so many great things they could be reading, and they're gonna have a better experience if it's something that they want to be reading. I just think it's kind of usually not worth a fight, and it's often counterproductive. I really think a lot of times they're not gonna like it just because you told them
Can I make a suggestion?
to read it, please.
When my kids got to be like third grade, if they weren't already ravenous readers, I started paying them $1 a chapter book. And what's weird to me is like after about $5 worth, they all decided they didn't need to be paid anymore. They knew they were being
Yeah.
patronized and taken on as their.
Wait, but you're paying them while patronizing them.
Yeah, you would think that they would just keep on taking the money, but they kind of were happy to graduate after that. Had a dodgy mistake.
Whatever it takes. I do think not necessarily, this wouldn't necessarily work with it, to force them to totally read a book that they didn't have to read for school necessarily, but I do think being really creative like that kind of thing, or maybe if it's something they do have to read for school, but they claim they despise it, they're really not interested, maybe they're really not. All they want to do is make comic books or something, or they think they're going to be a film director later. Tap into that. Like, okay, if you were making this movie, who would you cast? And why? Well, why do you think, what qualities of this character what actor do you think would capture the qualities of this character? Or, which of these scenes do you think would be the most important scene in the movie? You don't want this secret to come out that comes out at the end of the book, but you have to have hints. How would you do that? Or, okay, well, make a first page comic book of this story. So I think, even with high schoolers, I've never done the comic book thing, but even with high schoolers, I sometimes do this which celebrity do you think you would use to do this? Or because they still have to have a conversation about the book, about the character, about the qualities of the character, but it's putting it in terms that they like more, they think is cooler, they're more familiar with, whatever it is. So I think sometimes you just have to be really creative and not, we're not all going to like the same thing in the same way. So what way are they going to not necessarily like it, but be engaged? Maybe that's the goal, is how do I engage them? Whether or not they love it, we can't control that. We can't control, it's like a fight to figure out what you're wearing the mask every Sunday. I can't control the feelings you're going to have for this book, but you can kind of force them to be engaged a little bit, because hating it is still engaged with it. Okay, 6th, 7th, 8th grade. I have never read The Bronze Bow either. There were just 2 that I had never read, and this is one I hadn't. But I'm looking forward to reading this next year, because we're going to have someone moving up to 6th grade. So this one is set in Galilee in the 1st century, and it's about a Jewish boy whose father is crucified by the Romans, and this leads to other family tragedies as well. And so he has this real hate for the Romans, and kind of gets in with these groups that are all about making the Romans pay and kicking them out. But then he meets Jesus and is interested in what this man has to say, but also doesn't want to hear it because he wants to just be mad and to get revenge. And so there's this real back and forth, kind of this moral dilemma that he's having. 7th grade, we're starting to move into a lot more, difficult stuff, although it's long, but Count of Monte Cristo is probably one of the books I think that they like the most from junior high, because it's such a page turner.
Do they read the whole thing?
It's abridged, but even abridged, it's 300 pages or something. So this is a great one because it's enjoyable, it's a page turner, you really want to know what happens. And you find yourself rooting for someone who wants revenge. I mean, he's the main character, so you're drawn to him, obviously. But he's trying to get revenge in kind of terrible ways. And you're rooting for him because what happened to him was wrong. But then you're also going, oh wait, he's completely blinded by his desire for revenge. And so I think this is a good opportunity to talk to kids about sometimes who we sort of feel that we should side with is not necessarily who we should side with. But it's redemptive as well, because likely the character realizes that he has this flaw. So this is great. If you haven't already read that, I really suggest it. It is very, very fun. And then 8th grade, Call of the Wild, another one probably a lot of people read when they were younger. There's something kind of, I think extra special about reading stuff that you read as a kid that you liked and then reading it with your kids, although then it's hard, I guess, if they don't like it. But so Call of the Wild, another classic, told from the point of the view of the dog, but also leads to interesting questions about friendship. What is a friendship? What is this relationship that has always been important to humans, between humans and dogs? And from the dog's point of view, we get this kind of a critical look at all of the different people in his lives, and he's comparing them and we're comparing them. So Call of the Wild's a great book. So moving into high school, for the freshmen and the sophomores, I have 2 suggestions actually for each. The freshmen, the first suggestion is not, if you can read the whole Aeneid with your kid, that would be great. The high schoolers don't actually even read the whole thing, they read sections of it. But if you're going to read just part of it, book 2 is the book to read. This is where the scene where Aeneas is carrying his father and the household gods, and he has his family, and they're escaping Troy. It's probably kind of the height emotionally of the book, even though it comes so early. So we have the fall of Troy, and he's trying to decide, do I stay and fight, or do I ignore all of those sort of very manly reactions and save my family? It's great. And any translation is great. The translation we use at school, which we really, really like, is relatively new by this woman, Sarah Rudin. It's really accessible. It's very easy to understand. The freshmen get through it without any problems. Because that's short, because the section we have suggested is really short, and because I like it, we have also suggested Antigone. Also short, also great, really powerful. Greek tragedy is just, it's who's at the foundation of all of this. It's kind of it's a classic tragedy. It fits all of the parts of it, and it's interesting and beautiful. And Antigone has to decide if she's going to what?
I have a question.
Oh. Antigone has to decide if she's going to follow the laws of man or follow the laws of the gods. And she has these great speeches. And she is the heroine, but it's a little more complex than that. It's kind of simplified to say the laws of man, the laws of God. Well, obviously we would side with the laws of God, but it's a little more complex than that, but it's interesting. Yes.
I was just going to elaborate on the point that you totally stole my thunder on there at the end. This year, I teach the 9th graders this year, and this year more than others, the students really had a problem with the way Antigone goes about her actions. So it's a good example of a main character who's clearly the moral center of the book and the moral exemplar of the book, but even there's a complexity to her character. She's open to criticism for a lot of things that she does and the manner in which she does them. That's a great level of complexity certainly for adults, but for high school students, where she's doing the right thing, but is she doing it in the right way and for all the right reasons? And it introduces a number of considerations in what could be a very simplistic story. And so those are the sorts of things that really jump out, obviously, for high-level books. We're all familiar with reading books or watching movies like that, but it was kind of cool this year. This year's freshman class, maybe because they are so unique. Some just, they love Antigone, and that's all there is to it. I have to kind of prod out some of those questions. This year, I had to kind of defend her more often. I was like,
yeah,
pretty harsh.
Actually, Mary Claire's year, I had the same thing. She was like, she really didn't like her. Well, and Creon, the bad guy, right, is more complex than just the bad guy. Like, he's in charge of the stability of the whole. It's not really a country, it's the city-state, but he's in charge of the stability of this whole thing, And he has to make, it's his job to make unilateral decisions, and you ought to be able to put yourself in his place too and say, well, you know, he has a point here. Like, why is he doing this in the first place? So yeah, there's a lot of complexity to it.
It also does a good job of exploring what the different kinds of piety come
Yes,
into conflict.
exactly.
The different strings, you know, duty towards family, duty towards the gods, duty towards your country, all are pulling on you in
Yeah.
different ways. How do you decide which one to?
Yeah, divided loyalties, basically. Which actually is a perfect segue to, well, sort of. It's not the perfect segue, but there it does come up. Now that I'm looking at it. So for sophomore year, which is what I teach, I had 2 suggestions also, because it's my talk and I can do that. And because I couldn't choose between them. Gunner's Daughter is fantastic. If you've never read it, you should. This is one of those books where horrible, dark, terrible things happen. But they're shown to be horrible and dark and terrible. And it's really great because it's set in the Icelandic and the Norwegian culture, right? They're pagans, and it's right when Christianity is being introduced. And so this is all very new. And characters know about Christianity, and some of them slowly become Christian, but their understanding of it is very limited. And they have been raised with these pagan values of revenge and honor and all of these things. And so they're, you know, what do you do? And it's the kids are always engaged. They really hate this character, and they really like this one, and then it switches, and they really hate this one, they really like this one. There's a real powerful emotional response with this book, and real redemption for at least one character. And the author, Sigrid Undset, is just amazing. She's trying to write this basically in the style of the Old Norse saga. So it's kind of this very stripped down, not a lot of extra detail sort of language, but it's really excellent. And I put Beowulf up there too because we kind of all know the name Beowulf. Hopefully no one was unfortunate enough to have watched that horrifying movie version of it that came out 10 years ago or whatever it was. But English literature begins with Beowulf. And it's the greatest and one of the only remaining examples we have of Anglo-Saxon literature. But it's just a great story. And great monsters and a great hero. And it's set in a pagan time. So he's a great pagan hero, but it's being written by a Christian author many years later. And so the hero also has Christian qualities, and part of what makes him stand out from just other brave warriors in the book are his Christian qualities. And so there's this kind of, in class we had this conversation about, you know, what makes him great. It's this combination of pagan and Christian qualities. And, you know, what makes a king, and what is so terrible about the monster. It's a book that's often taught very incorrectly in college, where we're supposed to feel really bad for the poor monster because those really mean men have kicked him out, and he's misunderstood, and it's just so horribly twisted you can't even fathom it, but that's what's being done. That is what's being done in the college classrooms. So yeah. There's a whole musical about it, which you know it's bad if they've made a musical about it. So these are our suggestions. And this translation, there's many translations of it. The one we read in class is by this Irish poet who actually died a few years ago, Seamus Heaney. And I really like it. I think the language is very beautiful, and I think it's pretty accessible, even though it's kind of old sounding. And another thing that I really like about Beowulf is that actually the things they value, they're very conservative values in it. That we should praise warriors. Warriors are important. Power is important. This male desire to protect is good and not toxic. And the old things are worthwhile. New stuff might not work. Old things does. Tradition. So we talk about that a lot in class, how it brings that, how truth, saying what is true, even if it's awkward, is as important. So there's a lot of really great kind of conservative truths in this book. And finally, for the juniors and seniors, Paradise Lost, they read just, you doing the whole thing now, or is it still just sections of it?
You almost.
It's almost the whole thing. Paradise Lost is England's greatest epic poem. And Milton is trying to copy the Greek and the Roman kind of classical style of what is an epic. And if you have a junior, they should be able to talk about what makes something an epic. What does it mean to start in media res and all these things that we kind of drill into them every year, actually. Milton is often said to be, after Shakespeare, the greatest storyteller and master of the language. Obviously, that's up for heated debate, but he's clearly one of the greatest English writers.
Some people put him above Shakespeare.
Yeah, that's true.
As far as the one work is a greater work.
Right, that stands on its own, exactly. And Mrs. Lassard mentioned there's a very good recording that's listed here. So it is kind of long. It is difficult. It's the most difficult thing that the juniors read. So doing it, listening to it in the car might be advisable. But this is another book that is very poorly twisted in college, but it's much more understandable here. Because the main character in a lot of ways is Satan. It begins with him waking up in at the edge of a lake of fire because he's just been thrown out of heaven. Because epics always start in the middle of things. So it starts with him looking up and looking around, and he sees all his fallen comrades who took that step and joined forces with him, and he gives these amazing speeches, and he's really, really interesting and compelling. And you kind of admire his character. And a combination of that, the compelling aspect of his character, and the fact that Milton historically was kind of a rebel against the king at the time. People put these together and they say, well, actually this book is all about, secretly, Milton is arguing that Satan is the hero, that it was good that he rebels against God because God is a tyrant. And that's kind of the standard reading these days in college. But you can kind of understand why here, because the character is so interesting. But really, it's an opportunity to look at, well, what is Milton saying here about sin? Sin is really interesting, and it's really compelling, and it's exciting. Sometimes it sounds really good. I mean, if it didn't, no one would sin, right? If it was boring and stupid, no one would be tempted to sin. And so he's capturing that. And as the book goes on, Satan's motives become a lot less shiny, and his language becomes a lot uglier, and he becomes uglier, and we see more and more the selfishness of his motives, and he is juxtaposed to Christ, who even before the fall of Adam and Eve says, yes, we're God, I can see that this is going to happen. Yes, I already agreed to die for them before they even need it. So as the book goes on, we see that Milton is not holding Satan up as this great rebel against a tyrant. He's talking about the nature of sin and how it pulls us in and how it can blind us and look shiny and glorious and worthwhile. But actually what's heroic is sacrifice and loyalty. So it's fantastic. Actually, and my memory of teaching this is slowly walking in and saying, after the first assignment, slowly walking in and saying, I really, really like this. I was like, good, I do too.
A lot of us that they had read in college in a big rush probably didn't enjoy it very much. I think if you take the time just to do it at the pace that we do it for the juniors, you'll enjoy it more.
And
I
that,
know I didn't really care for it at all in college, but teaching it, I really liked it, and my students liked it.
Yeah.
We did more schools.
and that reading in a rush is that's what too many professors have probably done. They read the first chapter
Yeah.
and they write all their papers on that. Oh, surely Satan's the hero. And then if you actually read through it, in fact, Milton, I think one of the most brilliant parts of it, it's also one of the most horrific, is the description of how sin actually arises. It's
Yeah.
kind of personified in this kind of very perverse sort of, it's not gratuitous, but it's quite gross, the way sin actually comes to be.
Yeah.
Beginning in the mind of Satan. All you have to do is read that and realize, hey, he's not the
Oh
hero.
yeah, this isn't.
terrible.
This is clearly not
But you gotta
good.
read past the first
Yeah.
chapter to get there. Yeah.
Or put down your our predetermined decisions about what you think everything is about.
I also, so one thing, a kind of hook I use with my students when we begin this is just telling them with their experience with superhero movies, where these incredible forces are used against each other,
Mm-hmm.
that they are a little bit more imaginatively equipped to catch up with Milton's
To picture it,
vision of
yeah.
the battle between the angels, in which mountains are being thrown at each other,
Yeah.
and yet they, kind of shake it off and
Yeah.
go back to the
Yeah. No, the battle scenes are fantastic. In Dubois' battle, yeah, it's really great. It is a little bit of work. The language is difficult. You're working through it. It's well worth it. And then finally, for the seniors, and I was so glad that you suggested this one because this is what I wanted to suggest. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Again, we kind of like, oh, Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, right? We have the picture of Tom Sawyer painting the fence. Very different book. A great book. Ernest Hemingway famously wrote, "All modern literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn." This is classic Hemingway. Like, it sounds pretty good. Oh wait, that doesn't actually really make sense. That's not really true at all. But it does speak to the importance. It is important and influential.
But you're still quoting him years later. So
It's true.
That's probably
I like Hemingway. He was a terrible person, but I like Hemingway. But so it is an adventure. It's fun. Parts of it are very, very funny. It's also incredibly sad and very moving, and leads to this really good conversation. It's so amazing as Huck is building his relationship with this escaped slave Jim, and he has all these moments where he has to make important decisions. And they meet, because they're traveling on the river and they keep stopping, they meet all of these different people, and it's an opportunity for Twain to kind of discuss this kind of person and this caricature of a person, this kind of person, and criticize all of these things. And Huck is growing through all of this, and then at the end of the book, Tom Sawyer shows back up, and everything kind of changes. Actually, there's a pretty good argument that the end does not really fit in many ways with the rest of the book. Twain actually paused for several years, I think, but he didn't know how to finish it. Anyway, so it is a really great book, but it's not without its problems, which I think is an interesting thing too to discuss. Like, you can like a book but still be able to say, but this, I'm not Mark Twain, I'm not publishing books, but this seems problematic for these reasons, and that's a really good conversation to have. But if you've never read it, do yourself a favor and read it. It's great, and it has one of the greatest sort of like friendship sacrifice scenes in all of literature. And it's interesting to talk about Huck as this last question, or one of the last questions here is he the quintessential American hero? And some things that we consider sort of heroic in pop culture and our heroes are not necessarily like good things all of the time. He's really tricky and crafty, but he has all these things that we see in other characters that we like. So in that way, the character has been very influential. And the way it's also, I always like talking with the seniors when I taught this class. How is it that Twain is able to capture the voice of a child, and does he do it well? And what would it, what's it like to try and write like a child? See things from their point of view, and they tell something one way, but we as the reader can see that they don't get it all. And anyway, so there's a lot to talk about with that book. as well. So again, these are just suggestions. This is what the teachers from all these levels suggested, and you can use these questions or your own questions. It's meant to just be a starting point, and to do as best as we all can. And I said I was going to read all the 5th grade books as Blaze read them this year, and I've read one. So we set goals, and then we just try. Actually 2. I read Shadow of the Bull. I don't know if anyone else has ever read that. Shadow of the Bull is fantastic. I think that's the summer reading for 5th grade. So, it's just a starting point. If your kids have other things they'd rather you read, do that. If they'll let you read out loud to them and you have the time to read out loud to them, that is even better. But if you're each reading it on your own and just trying to have that conversation. And I think also, too, you're asking the 5th grader, what books are you reading, and you're talking about it and trying to pull as much. And the other younger ones, they're hearing it. They're already hearing about this book that they'll get to read. They're already thinking like, oh, in 5th grade, I'll get to do that. So again, this like literary culture where they're familiar with these terms and familiar with the titles, and we're all, the whole family is suddenly talking about the same thing, and not all of it, but just enough, a little bit more.
On that point, I was thinking earlier, one thing I'm worried about is when our oldest were young, we were reading a lot to them at their level. And we're still reading to them at their level, or reading with them at their level. But the younger ones are not getting as much reading at their, us reading those same little books that we were reading when they were.
I think we all do that, right?
Yeah.
My youngest can barely do any nursery rhymes. I'm like, how did this happen?
Very strange vocabulary. And their peers will make fun of them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's true. It's like they might not have all the nursery rhymes, but, I mean, Seraphim already knows who Beowulf is. So, I don't know if that's good or bad, but yeah, I do think, I kind of feel like this was sort of meant to just, in some ways, be a pep talk a little bit. Like, I know, we all know it's important to read to our kids, obviously, but we're so busy, and it's so easy not to, and especially when they can read on their own, we're like, okay, we'll go read on your own. So yeah, it's just kind of this like,
So
we kind of alternate sometimes. Like I'm reading The Third Little House, the Prairie book out loud right now, but we don't do it every night. Sometimes the youngest one gets to pick just a storybook. So I kind of just try to rotate in, so everyone's getting a little bit of what's at their level, but also, the 7-year-old still kind of likes that picture book.
Your older kids, and they really enjoy slumming it with their.
Recording it over.
And they don't want to admit it, but they kind of like that one,
No, I was
Did you
going
have-
to suggest that. Just to have your older kids, and even if they can't read it, they sit next to each other and pretend they're reading.
Yeah.
I mean, that's actually.
Or they tell, look, I'm reading the so-and-so, and they're just telling it because they've heard it so much. My brother could do
That's
all
my
of
Dr.
Go Dog
Seuss.
Go, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's